All right, hello again, folks, for some more law school reading experiences. Right now, we are going to read for the Rule of Law seminar. We are going to read a piece called Obedience from an anthology by the Oxford University Press, Chapter 9 Obedience. The question which meets on the threshold of their inquiries all who have speculated on the nature of political society and the foundations of law is this: what is the force that brings and keeps men under governments? Or, in other words, what is the ground of obedience? 1. Theories regarding political obedience. The answers given by philosophers to this question, while varying in form, group themselves under two main heads. Some assign fear as the ground, some reason. One school discovers the power that binds men together as members of a state in physical force, acting upon them through dread of death or other physical evil. The other conceives it to lie in a rational view of the common advantage, which induces men to consent of their own free will to forego some measure of their supposed original personal independence in order to obtain certain common benefits. Thus, while the former school finds the origin of law in compulsion, the latter finds it in agreement. Both schools are of high antiquity and have been represented by many eminent names. One gathers from Plato that divers sophists maintained the former thesis. It is a substance not far from that assigned to Thrasymachus in the Republic, where the sophist says justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger, and in later times Hobbes and Bentham are eminent among those who embrace it. The other view is most familiar to moderns from the writings of Rousseau, but it has a long and interesting history, intertwined with that of the notions of the state of nature, the law of nature, and also with the history of the conception of sovereignty, topics which are discussed elsewhere in this volume. Rousseau grounds obedience on the original social contract, whereby each and every person agrees with every other to forego his natural freedom by constituting a state which is to act for all, and in which the citizen recovers his freedom because he is himself a part of the general will, to which he renders a reasonable service. The Aristotelian doctrine that men are by their very constitution social creatures, naturally drawn to create and live in communities, comes nearer to the second view, while escaping by its generality the expression of the errors into which those who have set a political society on the foundation of a contract have frequently been betrayed. And it need not be added that many other philosophers in comparatively modern times, basing the state, some of them on the nature of man, some on the eternal reason or the will of God, have held that it thereby acquires an absolute right to obedience from its members. These speculations, however, seldom touch the particular point I propose to discuss here, viz., the grounds which actually dispose men to obedience. Of the two chief older theories, that which represents men as led by reason to enter into a contract has of late fallen into discredit, being indeed so evidently opposed to what we know of the early state of mankind that it may be doubted whether most of those who propounded or have adopted it did not mean it to be taken rather as an epilogue, or a mythical presentation of moral facts than as a piece of history. The theory of force and fear, on the other hand, has retained much of its vogue, having connected itself with a system of jurisprudential terminology which is, or lately was, influential in England and not unknown in America. According to Bentham and his followers, there is in every state a sovereign who enjoys unlimited physical and therefore also unlimited legal power. His might makes his right. He rests on force and rules by fear. He has a sole right of issuing commands. His commands are laws. They are enforced by threats and are obeyed in respect of the apprehension of physical harm to follow on disobedience. Whether those who adhere to this body of doctrine think it historically true as an account of the origin of law, or merely adopt it as a concise explanation and summary view of the principles on which modern law and highly developed forms of political society are based, is not always clear from the language they use. But the importance they attach to force appears not only from the contempt they pour on the contractual theory of government, but also from their omission to refer to any facts in the character and habits of mankind except those which are connected with force and fear as factors in the development of the social organism. A little reflection will, however, convince anyone who comes to the question with an open mind that both these theories, that of compulsion as well as that of contract, are alike incomplete, and because incomplete, are misleading. They err as all systems are apt to err, not by pointing to a wholly false cause, but by extending the efficiency of a true cause far beyond its real scope. Rousseau is right in thinking that a political society needs a moral justification, and that the principle of individual freedom is best satisfied when everyone obtains a share in the government which he submits. The contractualist generally may find a solid basis for authority in the fact that organized society does not actually render to each of its members some return for their so-called natural liberty, which was surrendered. Even a bad government gives him at least a measure of protection, however imperfect, for his person and property against the attacks of anyone but the government itself. Here, there is, if not what we can call an implied contract, at least a consideration, a sort of mutuality of services in the political relation for which each member gives something and from which each gains something. To go further and either to explain the growth of government by a conscious bargain at some past moment, or to conceive the idea that no such bargain at present to the bulk of those who live in any actual society now, or to regard the individual members of society as entitled to act upon contractual principles toward their government and one another, is to plunge at once into what are not more palpably historical errors than unworkable principles. So, also, the school of Thrasymachus and that which claims Hobbes as its founder are right in feeling that some test must be found of the solidity of a community and the actual working strength of its machinery. And they discover this in fact that physical force is the ultima ratio, wherein to coerce the disturbers of the community and the transgressors of the law. Without force in the background, be the law might be defied. It is when the men of the school, or some of them, go on to represent physical compulsion as the means by which communities have been in fact formed, though to be sure, Hobbes himself alleges a contract at the very first step. Footnote: see as the doctrine of Hobbes, the essay on sovereignty, which follows in this essay. And fear is the motive which in fact secures respect to the law from the majority of the citizens, they that depart alike from history and from common sense. The problem of political cohesion and obedience is not so simple as either school of theorists would represent it. To show that both schools are historically wrong would not be sufficient. This has been often done as against such of the contractualists as have held that conscious reason brought men out of the state of nature by a compact, and if the historians who deal with the earlier stages of human progress have not cared to demolish the physical force doctrine, this may have happened because none has thought it worthwhile to refute a theory whose flimsiness they have perceived, but which they have deemed to lie outside the sphere of history. As it is to a historian who best understands how much force has done to build up states, so he most fully sees that force is the only one among many factors, and not the most important in creating, molding, expanding, and knitting together political communities. It is not, however, necessary to institute any historical inquiry in order to reach this conclusion. An easier course is to interrogate one's own consciousness and to observe one's fellow men. The problem of obedience to government and law is part of the larger and even more obvious problem on the grounds of obedience in general. Why do we all forego the gratification of many of our personal desires, desires themselves harmless, merely because they are not shared by others? Why do we go on echoing opinions whose soundness we more than doubt? Why do we pursue pleasures which give us no amusement, but rather weariness? Why do we adhere to a party, political or ecclesiastical, whose conduct we often disapprove? Why, in fact, is so large a part of our daily conduct determined not by our own natural preferences, but by compliance with the opinion of others, or submission to the social conditions that surround us? 2. The grounds of obedience in general. 1 second. Political obedience is not a thing by itself, but a form of what we may call compliance in general. The grounds or motives of compliance can be summed up under 5 heads, putting them in order of what seems to be their relative importance. They may be described as following: indolence, deference, sympathy, fear, and reason. Let us consider each separately. By indolence, I mean the disposition of a man to let someone else do for him what would give him trouble to do for himself. There are, of course, certain persons to whom exertion, mental as well as physical, is pleasurable, and who delight in the effort of thinking out a problem and making a decision for themselves. There are also moments in the lives of most of us when, under the influence of some temporary excitement, we feel equal to the long succession of such efforts. But these are exceptional persons and rare moments. The vast majority of mankind, nothing is more agreeable than to escape the need for mental exertion, or, speaking more precisely, to choose only those forms of exertion which are directly accompanied by conscious pleasure and involve little fatigue. In a great many exertions of thought, resulting in determinations of the will, there is no pleasure, or at any rate no conscious pleasure, or at any rate no pleasure which is not outweighed by an accompanying annoyance. Such exertions may relate to things in which we have slight personal interest, and therefore no desires to gratify, or to things in which our personal interest is so doubtful that we shrink from the trouble of ascertaining which way it lies, and are glad to shift the responsibility from ourselves to whoever will undertake it for us. The ascendancy of one of a married couple, for instance, or of one member of a group of persons living together, is usually acquired in some such way. It is not necessarily the will really strongest that in these cases prevails, but the will which is most active, most ready to take a little trouble on, to exert itself on trivial occasions, and undertake small responsibilities. Persons of a resolute and tenacious character are sometimes also hesitant and undecided because they cannot be at the trouble of setting to work for the little questions of the daily life, their whole machinery of deliberation and volition. In 5 persons out of 6, the instinct to say yes is stronger than the instinct to say no. No, were it not so, there would be fewer marriages. And this is especially so when the person who claims consent possesses exceptional force and self-confidence. In other words, most of us hate trouble and like to choose the line of least resistance. In tropical Africa, the country is covered with a network of narrow footpaths made by the natives. These paths seldom run straight, and their flexuosities witness to small obstacles, here a stone, there a shrub, which the feet of those who first marked them avoided. Today, one may perceive no obstacle. The prairie which the path crosses may be smooth and open, yet every traveler follows the windings, because it is less trouble to keep one's feet in the path already marked than it is to make a more direct route for oneself. The later process requires thought and attention, the former does not. Nor is the compliance of indolence less evident through its in thought than action. To most people, nothing is more troublesome than the effort of thinking. They are pleased to be saved the effort. They willingly accept what is given to them because they have nothing to do further than to receive it. They take opinions presented to them and assume rules or institutions which they are told to admire to be right and necessary, because it is easier to do this than to form an independent judgment. The man who delivers opinions to others may be inferior to us in physical strength, or in age, or in knowledge, or in rank. We may think ourselves quite as wise as he is, but he is clear and positive. We are lazy or wavering, and therefore we follow him. Under the name of deference, it is convenient to include the various cases in which some emotion, drawing one person to another, disposes the former to comply with the will of the latter. Whether the emotion be love or reverence or esteem or admiration or persuasion of superior goodness or of superior wisdom, there is a feeling on the part of the person attracted which makes him ready to sacrifice his own impulses, if they be not of unusual strength, to the will of the person loved or reverenced or admired. Wisdom and goodness give their possessor a legitimate authority. Wisdom in making him appear as a fit person to follow, where the question is of choosing means. Goodness, where it is a question of the choice of ends, and the belief that those qualities exist in the person revered or esteemed, is just as effective as the reality. Such belief being obviously the result of many causes besides a rational scrutiny. The force of the feeling of deference in securing compliance or adhesion varies in differing nations and in different states of society. The advantages, for instance, which rank, wealth, and learning give to a candidate for any public post in a modern country like France or England only faintly represent the authority which belonged to birth, learning, and sanctity, whether real or supposed in simpler times. A so-called holy man, as the Mussulman or Hindu East, or a fakir or a guru, exerts today enormous power in his own neighborhood. in respect far less of any fear, of the harm he can do than simply of the veneration he inspires. Even if he does not claim direct supernatural mission, his words carry great weight. There is an abundant evidence in the careers of famous Europeans in the East to show how readily, in primitive times, a remarkable character and career would permanently attach a halo, not only of admiration, but of submissive deference to the descendants of such a person, or to the occupant of the office that he had filled. By sympathy as a ground of obedience, I mean not merely the emotion evoked by the sight of a corresponding emotion in another, but various forms of what may be called the associative tendency of mankind, the disposition to join in doing what one sees others doing, or in feeling as others feel. The root of this instinct lies very near indolence, for no way of saving effort is so obvious as to do what others have done or are doing. But it is not quite the same thing as indolence, for it is a tendency strong among some of the less indolent races of mankind, and each of us must have noted from his own personal experience that its action depends as much upon the susceptibility of the imagination as upon the slowness or slackness of the will. There is hardly a more potent factor than this in the formation of communities, whether social or political, because it unites with, if it not be almost identical with, what we call party and civic spirit, substituting a sense of and pleasure in the exercise of the collective will for the pleasure of exerting individual will, and thus tending to subordinate the latter, and to make it rejoice in following, perhaps blindly, that will which directs the common action. The shock to individual pride is avoided because each man acts spontaneously at the bidding of his own emotions and feels that way he may lose as an individual, he recovers as a member of the body, and that with a better chance of indulging his passions at the expense of his antagonists. The spirit of the body seems to live in and inspire him, increasing indefinitely in the force of his own personality. Obedience to the directing authority is here a first necessity, and becomes more implicit the greater the dangers of whatever enterprise the body may undertake. As fighting covers greater part of life of primitive communities, the disposition to obey becomes early strong among them, because if nothing is obedience so essential as in war. Perhaps these three sources of the tendency to comply are really only forms of, as they are certainly all closely connected with, the disposition to imitate, which is so strong not only in men but throughout the animal kingdom, so far as we can observe it. With 99 sheep, one after another, jump over a fence at precisely the point where the first of the flock has jumped, they reveal a propensity similar to that which makes a file of savages traveling over a wilderness each tread on the footsteps of his predecessor, or that which soon stamps the local accent upon the tongue of a child brought from some other part of the country, where the mode of such speech was different. There is evidently a psychological, doubtless indeed a physiological cause for this general and powerful tendency to reproduce the acts and ways of other creatures, even where, as in the case of a local accent, there is no motive whatever for doing so. Conscious imitation is of course frequently explainable by the desire to please, or by a perception of the advantage of doing so as others do. There are also many facts that show that its roots lie deeper, and that it is due largely to a symptom between the organs of perception and those of volition, what goes on unconsciously or subconsciously in states of mind, and which makes the following of others, the reproduction of their acts or the adoption of their ideas, to be the path of least resistance, which is therefore usually followed by weaker natures and frequently even by stronger ones. Of fear and reason, nothing need be said, because the school of Hobbes and Bentham, for the one, and the apostles of democratic theory, for the other, have said more than all that is needed to show the part they respectively play in a political society. Fear is no doubt the promptest and most effective means of restraining the turbulent or criminal elements in society, and is of course the last and necessary expedient when authority, either largely established or actually dominant, is threatened by insurrection. Reason operates and operates with increasing force as civilization advances upon the superior minds, leading them to forego the assertion that their own wills, where such assertion would be in itself innocent or beneficial, merely because the authority which rules in the community has otherwise directed. Reason teaches the value of order, reminding us that without order there can be little progress, and preaches patience, holding out a prospect that evils will be amended by the general tendency for truth to prevail. Reason suggests It is often better that the law should be certain than it should be just, and the existing authority should be supported rather than strife should be caused by the attempt to set up a better one. So also reason disposes minorities acquiescence, even where a majority is tyrannical, in the faith that tyranny will provoke a reaction and be overthrown by peaceful discussion. Allowing for the efficiency of fear or the efficacy of fear as a motive, acting powerfully upon the upon the ruder and more brutish natures, and for that of reason as guiding the more thoughtful and gentle ones, and admitting that neither can be dispensed with in any community, their respective parts would nevertheless seem to be less important than are the parts played by those three first mentioned motives. If it were possible, either in the affairs of the state or in the private relations of life, to enumerate the number of instances in which one man obeys the other, we should find the cases in which either the motive of fear or the moment of reason was directly and consciously present to be comparatively few, and their whole collective product in the aggregate of human compliance comparatively small. If one may so express it, in the sum total of obedience, the percentage due to fear and to reason, respectively, is much less than that due to indolence, and less also than that due to deference or to sympathy. In a large proportion of the cases arising in private life, the motive of fear cannot be invoked at all, because there is no power of inflicting harm, and reason just as little, because the persons who habitually apply um, rational sensitive processes to their actions are, after all, very few. It may be said that conscious thought is not ordinarily applied to action because habit supplies its place, and habit enabling and disposing us to do without consideration the acts which otherwise would need to be considered is a fact is in fact fossil reason. That is largely so, but habit is still more often the permanent and unchanging expression of indolence. Nothing becomes a habit so quickly as does the acquiescence due to indolence, nor does any tendency strike at its root so deep. And though it is true as regards to public or civic matters, physical force is always at hand in the background. We must also recognize that the background is not, in fact, usually visible to the majority of those who act according to the laws which they obey. They do not necessarily or even generally think of the penalties of the law. They defer to it from respect, and because other people defer, they are glad that it is there to save them and other people from the trouble. This attitude is not confined to civilized states and has existed always, even in unsettled societies, where the law of might not be able to prevail but for the aid of the private citizens. Of the three springs of obedience which have been represented as on the whole of the stronger, indolence disguises itself more under deference. In deference, its it is intensified by sympathy. That is to say, the tendency of men to let others take decisions for them, which they might take for themselves, becomes much stronger and more constant when they have any ground for believing others to possess some sort of superiority, while the disposition to admit superiority is incomparably more active, where a number of other persons are perceived to also be admitting it. A society like that, in which modern men live in England or America, is apt to suppose that the admission of superiority mortifies a man's pride. But this is so far from being generally true that the attitude of submission is to most men rather pleasurable than the reverse. So Protestants have been apt to assume that the natural and normal attitude of man in the religious matters is independence, a wish to seek out truth for himself, a sense of the duty of consulting his own conscience, whereas the opposite is the fact. And those religious systems take the greatest hold upon man which leave least to individual choice, and inculcate not merely humility towards the unseen powers, but the duty of implicitly accepting definite traditions or of revering and following the visible ecclesiastical guides. Some philosophers have talked of will as a distinctive note of man, and insofar as the exercise of will implies a conscious exertion of rational choice, it may be admitted to be characteristic of him alone. But in mere tenacity of purpose and persistence in a particular course, other animals run him hard. A rogue elephant or a bucking mustang can show as much persistence, sometimes mingled with a craft which seeks to throw opponent off his guard, and bides its time till the most favorable moment for the resistance to arrive. In most men, the want of an individual will, that is to say, the proneness to comply with or follow the will of another, is a specially conspicuous phenomenon. It is for this reason that a single strenuous and unwearying will sometimes becomes so tremendous a power. There are in the world comparatively few such wills, and when one appears united to high intellectual gifts, it prevails whichever way it turns, because the weaker bow to it and gather around it for shelter, and in rallying to it increase its propulsive and destructive power. It becomes almost a hypnotizing force. One perceives this most strikingly among the weaker races of the world. They are not necessarily less intelligent races. In India, for instance, the average European finds many Hindus fully his equals in intelligence, in subtlety, and the power of speech, but he feels his own volitions and his whole personality to be so much stronger than that of the great bulk of the native population, excluding a very few races, that men seem to him no more than stalks of corn whom he can break through and shred on in his own wayward march. This is how India was conquered and is now held by the English. Superior arms, superior discipline, stronger physique are all secondary causes. There are other races far less cultivated and far less subtle and ingenious than the Hindus, with whom Europeans have found it harder to deal because the tenacity of purpose and the pride of the individuals were greater. This is the case with the North American Indians, who fought so fiercely for their lands that it had been estimated that in long conflict had been maintained they may have probably killed more white men than they had lost at the hands of the whites. Yet they were far inferior in weapons and military skill, and they had no religious motives to stimulate their valor. No one can read the history of the East without being struck by the extraordinary triumphs of a single energetic will that is frequently achieved there. A military adventurer, the chief of a petty tribe, suddenly rises to greatness, becomes the head of an army which attacks all of its neighbors, and pursues a career of unbroken conquest until he has founded a mighty empire. Perhaps he raises vast revenues, constructs magnificent works, establishes justice, creates a system of administration, which secures order and peace during his lifetime. Men like Thomas II, Cyrus, and Darius, son of Hyaspes, Croesus, Anurishwin, Saladin, Tamerlane, Babur, Akbar the Great, Hyder Ali are in their several ways only the most striking instances of the tremendous effect which a man of exceptional force and activity produces among Oriental peoples. Footnote. Some of these succeed to thrones already established, but their careers illustrate that nevertheless the result of brilliant gifts appearing in the midst of comparatively inert people. One asks why this happens chiefly in the East. Is there a greater difference in the Asiatic than the European peoples between the few most highly gifted men and the great mass of humanity, so that while the ordinary characters are weak, one strong character prevails swiftly and easily? Or is the cause rather to be sought in the fact that in the East there are no permanent institutions of government to be overthrown? That which is strong and permanent there, viz., the customs, religion, and legal of the people, a ruler does not, except in a fit of insanity, venture to touch, while the throes of a neighboring potentates go down to the stroke before him. In medieval or modern Europe, the weakness of the ordinary man was and is entrenched behind a fabric of government and law, which the strongest individual will cannot overthrow. And it is only when this fabric has been shattered by a revolution, as happened in France at the end of the 18th century, that the adventurer of genius and volition has a chance of rivaling the heroes of the East. Thus, the comparative stability of governments in medieval and modern Europe does not disprove the view which finds in the force of individual will and the tendency of the average man to yield to it a potent factor in compelling obedience. For in the European countries, the resistance offered to the ambition of such a will is effective, not so much because ordinary men are themselves more independent and more capable of opposition, as because their superior intelligence has built up well compacted systems of polity to which obedience has been long habited become attached. Obedience has by long habit become attached. Traditions of deference and loyalty have grown up around these systems so that they enable individuals to stand firmly together and constitute a solid bulwark against any personality less forceful than that of Julius Caesar or a Bonaparte. To this explanation, one may perhaps add another. In the East, the monarch is, as a rule, raised so far above his subjects that they are all practically on a level, as compared with him. And those who are for the moment powerful are powerful in the virtue of his favor, which has elevated and may at any moment abase them. This has long been the case in the Muslim states, and was to a large extent true in the Byzantine Empire. It is now to some degree true in Russia, where there is no land-holding or clan-leading aristocracy, nor any richly endowed hierarchy. there may be nothing to diminish the impression of overwhelming power which the sovereign's position produces. Hence, there may be no order of men to set the example of an independence of feeling or attitude which springs from their position as the leaders of their dependents and are entitled to be consulted by the crown. Such an order of men existed in the feudal aristocracy of the Middle Ages, which have done much to create the type of character in the States and modern Europe. To them has now succeeded in some modern countries a so-called aristocracy of wealth, which, vain as it may be of its opportunities for influencing others, is much less stable than was the landholding class of the old days, and much less high-spirited. Meanwhile, the general leveling down and up, which has created what we now call modern democracy, has, in reducing the number of those whom rank and tradition has made natural leaders, increased the opportunities of strong-willed and unscrupulous men, restless and reckless, versed in popular arts, the adroitly and adroitly using the most powerful of all agents for propagating uniformity of opinion, which we call the newspaper press. Powerful because it drives the individual to believe that if he differs from the masses, he must be wrong. Such a man may have a career in a huge democracy, which he could not have in a century ago, because the forces that resist are fewer and feebler today than they were then, and the multitude is more easily fascinated by audacity or force of will, apart from moral excellence, apart from intellectual distinction, than in an aristocratic society. It may help to explain the theory I'm trying to present if we pause for a moment to examine the influences under which the habit of obedience is first formed in the individual man and the nascent community. For the individual, it begins in the family, and it grows up there, only to a small extent by the action of force and fear. The average child, even in the days of a discipline harsher than that which we now obtains, did not, as a rule, act under concern or under coercion, but began from the dawn of consciousness to comply with the wish of the parent or the nurse, partly for the sense of dependence, partly from affection, partly because it saw that other children did the like. Force might sometimes be resorted to, but force was in most cases a secondary and subsidiary agency. Nor did force succeed so well as softer methods. Everybody knows that children who have been most often punished are not the most obedient. Nor is this merely because, being naturally self-willed, they have needed more coercion. After these little squalls of aimless passion, which belong to a certain period in a child's life, have passed away, the boy usually moves, as a matter of course, at his parents' bidding until the age is reached when circumstances oblige him to act for himself, or when the sense of independence is stimulated by perceiving that others of his own age will despise him if he remains too submissive. The child whose constant impulse is to disobey is as likely to turn out ineffective as a child who obeys too readily. For perversity is as frequently due to want of affection, sympathy, and common sense as to the exceptional force of will. Thus, most people enter into adult life having already formed the habit of obeying in many things where force and fear do not come in at all, but in which the most obvious motive is the readiness to be relieved of trouble and responsibility by following the directions of someone else, presumably superior. They have also formed during boyhood the habit of adopting the opinions of those around them. As an acute observer has said, that the chief fault of the English public school is that it makes this habit far too strong. Custom, that is to say, whatever is established and obeyed, has great power over them. No conservatism surpasses that of the schoolboy. It would never be safe to try to find a general explanation of the growth of the political communities in the phenomena of domestic life, though it was a favorite doctrine of a past generation that the germ or the type of the state was to be found in the family. There are some races among whom the family and its organization seem to have played no great part, but it is clear that in primitive societies, three forces, other than fear, have been extremely powerful: the reverence for ancient lineage, the instinctive deference to any person of marked gifts, with a disposition to deem those gifts supernatural, and the associative tendency which unites the members of a group or tribe so closely together that they practice joint action supersedes individual choice. These forces have imprinted the habit of obedience so deeply upon early communities that it has become a tradition, molding the minds of succeeding generations. Physical force had plenty of scope in the strife of clans or cities, or somewhat later of factions, and one another, but in the building up of the clan or the city it was hardly needed, for motives more uniform and steady in their efficiency were at work. To pursue this topic would lead into a field too wide for this occasion. Yet it is well to note two facts which stand out in the early history of those communities in which force and fear might seem to have had most to do with the formation of governments and the habit of obedience to authority. One is the passionate and persistent attachment to a particular reigning family, apart from their personal gifts, apart from their powers to serve the community or to terrify it. The Franks and the Gauls during the 7th and 8th centuries were as fierce and turbulent a race as the world has ever seen. Their history is a long record of incessant and ferocious strife. From the beginning of the 7th century, the Merwin kings, descendants of Clovis, became, with scarcely an exception, feeble and helpless. Their power passed to the viziers, the mayors of the palace, whom, from about AD 638 onwards, were kings de facto. But the Franks continued to revere the blood of Clovis, and when, in 656, a rash mayor of the palace had deposed a Merwin and had placed his own son on the throne, they rose at once against the insult offered to the ancient line, and its scions were revered as titular heads of the nation for a century longer, till Pippin the Short, having induced the Pope to pronounce the deposition of the last Merwin, or deposing the last Merwin, and to sanction the transfer of the crown to himself, sent that prince to a monastery. This instance is more than remarkable because the Franks, being Christians in a doctrine, if not in practice, can hardly have continued to hold the divine origin of their dynasty. The other fact to be dealt with is this, that where religion comes into the matter, we discover associative tendency of immense strength, which binds men into a community and wins obedience for those who, whether as priests or as kings, embody the unity of the community, who represent its collective relations with the unseen powers, who approach them with its collective service of prayers or sacrifice. Altars have probably done even more than hearth to stimulate patriotism, especially among those who, like the Romans, had sort of domestic altar for every hearth, and kept up worship of family and clan spirits beside the worship of the national god. It may be said the power of religion in welding men together and inducing them to obey kings or magistrates or laws is due to the element of fear in religion. Such an element has no doubt been at work, but its influence is more seen in the requirement of sacrifices to deities themselves than in enforcing obedience to the authorities and institutions of a state. What commends these latter to reverence is rather the belief that their divine appointment gives them a claim on the affection of the citizens, and makes it a part of the piety as well as the patriotism to support them. In the Old Testament, for instance, the love of Jehovah and the sense of gratitude to him for his favors to his people are motives invoked as no less potent than the dread of his wrath. There has always been a tendency, since Christianity lost its first freshness and power, to insist upon more material motives, upon those which appear palpable and ponderable, such as the fear of future punishment, rather than on those of a more refined and ethereal quality. But it was not by appealing to these lower motives that Christianity originally made its way in the Roman Empire. The element of fear, though not wholly absent from the New Testament, plays a very subordinate part there and became larger in medieval and modern times. Yet it may be doubted whether, in the growing stronger, it increased the efficiency of Christianity as an engine of moral reform. Perfect love chases out fear. It was the gospel of love, and not the fear of hell, that conquered the world, and made men and women willing to suffer death for their faith. The martyrs in the persecutions under Decius and Diocletian, and the Armenian martyrs of 1895, who were counted by the thousands, overcame the terror of impending torturing death, not from any thought of penalties in a world to come, but from the sense of honor and devotion which forbade them to deny God, whom they and their parents and forefathers had worshipped. Returning to the general question of the disposition of the average man to follow rather than to make a path for himself, it may be remarked that the abstract love of liberty, the desire to secure self-government for his own sake, apart from the benefits to be reaped from it, has been a comparatively feeble passion, even in nations far advanced in political development. It is not easy to establish this proposition by instances, because wherever arbitrary power is exercised, there are pretty certain to be tangible grievances, as well as denial of liberty, and where a monarch or an oligarchy attempts to deprive a people of the freedom they have enjoyed, they conclude, and with good reason, that oppression is sure to follow. But when the sources of insurrections are examined, it will almost be always found that the great bulk of the insurgents were moved either by the hatred of foreign domination, by the religious passion, or by actual wrongs being suffered. Those who, in drawing the sword, appeal to the love of liberty, and liberty only, are usually a group of persons who, like the last republicans of Rome, are either exceptional in their sense of dignity and their attachment to tradition, or deem the predominance of a despot injurious to their own position in the state. So we may safely say that rebellions and revolutions are primarily made not for the sake of freedom, but in order to get rid of some evil which touches men in a more tender place than their pride. They rise against oppression when it reaches a certain point, such as the spoiling of the goods by the tax gatherer, the invasion of their homes by the minions of tyranny, the enforcement of an odious form of worship, or perhaps some shocking deed of cruelty or lust. Once they have risen, the more ardent spirits involve the sacred name of liberty and fight under its banner. But so long as the government is fairly easy and tolerant, the mere denial of a shame in the control of public affairs is not acutely The mere denial of a share in control of public affairs is not acutely presented, and a great deal of paternally regulative despotism is acquiesced in. In AD 1863, when Bismarck was flouting the Prussian parliament, Englishmen were surprised at the coolness with which the Prussian people bore the violations of their not too liberal constitution. The explanation was that the country was well governed, and the struggle for political power did not move peasants and tradesmen otherwise contented with their lot. The English were a people singularly attracted to their ancient political and civil rights. Yet Charles I might probably have destroyed the liberties of England and would almost certainly have destroyed those of Scotland if he had left religion alone. One of the few cases that can be cited where a great movement sprang from the pure love of independence was in the migration of the chieftains of Western Norway into Iceland in the 9th century, rather than admit the overlordship of King Harold the Fair-haired. But even here, it is to be remembered that Harold sought to levy tribute, and the Norsemen were of all the races we know those in whom pride of personality and the spirit of independence glowed with the hottest flame. There are even times when people have enjoyed a disordered freedom, tire of it, and are ready to welcome, for the sake of order, any savior of society who appears, an Octavius Augustus, or even a Louis Napoleon. The great peril to self-government is at all times to be found in the want of zeal and energy among the citizens. This is a peril which exists in democracies as well as despotisms. Submission is less frequently due to overwhelming force than to the apathy of those who find acquiescence easier than resistance. Two questions arising out of the view that has been here presented regarding the main sources of obedience remain to be considered. One of these, that which bears upon the theory of jurisprudence as a science, being somewhat technical, had better not be suffered to interrupt the course of the general argument. I have therefore relegated it to a note at the end of this essay. 3. The future of political obedience. The other question which deserves to be examined is a much wider one. You know what? I'm going to stop the live stream here and we'll start another one because this is a long-ass live stream already. All right. The obedience. We're on part 3 next. The future of political obedience. Peace.